Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to test a customized moderated mediation model using process in SPSS, and the examples that I provide are going to involve a single moderator variable. Now before I get started, I do want to mention that underneath the video description you will find a link to the SPSS data file that I'll be working from in this presentation, so you can download a copy of the data to follow along. You will also find a link to the PowerPoint that I referenced throughout this video. Now, in order to test customized moderated mediation models or any other customized model using process, you will not be using the drop-down menus that you may be most familiar with, but instead you'll be using some basic syntax. So it's going to require going into the syntax editor and typing in some syntax in order to generate output for your models. So whereas other videos that I put together on moderated mediation have focused on some basics in terms of running the analyses using the drop-down menus and then interpreting results, what I'm going to be focusing on in this video is how to use the syntax in order to generate relevant output. So I'm not going to be spending really any time though going over the outputs themselves. This is mainly a how to use the syntax. So for our demonstration, we're going to be using data from an article by Zhao et al. On the relationship between anxiety and burnout among Chinese physicians, a moderated mediation model. This article was published in 2016 in the journal PLOS ONE. Just keep in mind that the analyses in this presentation are to provide examples only and do not reflect the author's original variable scoring or the models being tested. But briefly, this is just a screenshot of the first 5 rows of data, and the variables that we're going to be using include extroversion, neuroticism, burnout, positive coping, negative coping, and anxiety. And then I also have this ordered categorical variable for extroversion right here. It just represents a recoding of the original continuous variable into 3 groups. And but ordinarily I would not recommend doing that type of thing with respect to continuous variables, but that recoding was just done for the purpose of this demonstration. So I would like to start off with just a brief review of how to use the syntax in order to generate output for a standard mediation analysis. So yesterday I had put together a video on using the B matrix statement in conjunction with the syntax, the process syntax, in order to test a mediation model, and I'll include a link to that underneath the video description. So you can consider this as sort of an extension of that presentation, but I thought it was a good idea to begin there before we begin adding in moderator effects. So for this particular model, you'll see that we have neuroticism serving as the independent variable and burnout is serving as a dependent variable. We have anxiety, positive coping, and negative coping serving as 3 mediators. So that's designated by M1, M2, and M3 right here. Now, in using the syntax to run this particular model, you'll see that we start off with the process command followed by y equals and the name of our dependent variable, which is burnout. We have a /, then m equals, and then the names of our mediators, and you'll see that they are appearing in order of M1, M2, and M3. Then we have /, and then we have x equals, and then the name of my independent variable, /, and then we have B matrix equals, and then we have these values of 0 and 1 that are separated by commas that are given, and then followed by a period at the very end. So those values of 0 and 1 are values that are contained in this B matrix right here. Now, before I actually kind of walk you through that matrix, I do encourage you, when you are setting up customizable models, to draw out your model and then also to set up a B matrix of your own, because it's that B matrix that is specifying the different effects in the model. So with respect to the B matrix, you'll notice that up here I've got X, M1, M2, and M3. So these are basically the source of effects within the model. And then we have along in the first column M1, M2, and M3 and Y. And these are basically variables that are receiving effects from others within the model. So we'll start off in the first column where we have X. So you see that we are estimating a direct effect of X on M1, or neuroticism on anxiety. So we're going to give a value of 1 to indicate that we are estimating that effect. But now the remaining variables downstream, so to speak, we're not estimating any other direct effects. And so in that particular case, with respect to X, the effect of X on M2, we have a value of 0. X on M3, we have a value of 0. And then X on Y, we have a value of 0. Then in the second column, we move to M1, so this variable right here. And you'll notice that we have a dash that's given right here. Basically, we're going to leave that blank. And what we'll do is look at M1 in relation to the variables downstream. So in this case we have M1 predicting M2 right here, so we're going to give a value of 1 to indicate that we are estimating that effect, and then M1 to M3 right here, so we're going to give a value of 1 to indicate we're estimating that effect. And then we have M1 to Y, and now in this case we have a value of 0 right there. And so basically there is no direct effect of M1 on Y. So in other words, we're basically fixing that relationship to 0. Now when we move to the M2 column right here, you'll notice I've got a dash here and a dash here that's just signifying that we're not going to be putting any values there. But then we have M2 to M3, and we have a value of 0. So notice that there is no direct effect that is specified between M2 and M3. So we're effectively setting that relationship to 0. So that's reflected right here in this value. But we do have M2 to Y that's given right here. So we're going to be putting a 1 in this cell. And then we have M3 to Y, and we're going to put a 1 right here. So as you're looking at this matrix, you can see that all of these values, it looks like there's kind of a little triangle right here where we don't have any values that are given, and then we have values that are provided in the remainder of the matrix. So in order to fill out these values right here, basically what we're going to do is we start off in the first row and we have a value of 1, so for that first cell. Then we move to the second row because we don't have any other coefficients in the first row, and then we have 0 and 1, so that's going to be reflected by these values right here. Then we move to the third row and we have 0, 1, and 0 that are given, so there's 0, 1, and 0. And then we move to the fourth row where we have 0, 0, 1, and 1 right there, so there's 0, 0, 1, and 1. So that's basically all there is to it. So what I'll do is I'm going to take this syntax and we'll open up SPSS and put it into the syntax editor and generate our output. So here we are in SPSS, and we'll go to File, New, and then go down to Syntax. So now we have our syntax editor opened up, and I'm going to paste that in. I'd already typed it up, so I'm going to and copied it, so I'll paste it in. And so that's all the syntax that we had walked over or gone over just a second ago. So I'm going to highlight all of this and click the green arrow to get it to generate my output. And so after a few seconds we get our output, and you'll see it says right up here, it says model custom. Then we have Y is burnout, X is neuroticism, M1 is anxiety, M2 is positive coping, M3 is negative coping. There's our sample size right there. So like I said, I'm not going to spend really any time interpreting things, but we'll just briefly look at the regression submodels in that overall model. So you'll see that we have anxiety was regressed onto neuroticism. So there's our regression coefficient and t-test associated with that particular effect. Then when we scroll down a little bit further, you can see that we have positive coping, which was regressed onto anxiety right there. So again, we have our regression slope and then our significance test for that particular effect. Then moving down a little bit further, you can see that we have negative coping, which is regressed onto anxiety. Then we have burnout, which is regressed onto positive coping and negative coping. So we have those effects and their significance tests. And we'll scroll down a little bit further, and you can see that we have where it says direct and indirect effects of X on Y. You'll notice it says the direct effect of X on Y is fixed to 0, and that's because we did not ask for neuroticism to be specified as having a direct effect on burnout. So that's why that message is there. And then we have the indirect effects that are given within this particular model. And basically these are two specific indirect effects. So the first IND right here, we have neuroticism to anxiety to positive coping to burnout. And then the second specific indirect effect, we have anxiety to negative coping to burnout right there. So as we look at the indirect effects summary right here, you'll see we have the first indirect effect right there, and we have the confidence interval. If 0, the null falls between the lower and the upper bound, then we would infer that the indirect effect is equal to 0. If 0 falls outside that lower and upper bound, then we would infer that the indirect effect is different from 0. So at any rate, we have the first specific indirect effect, the second specific indirect effect with its confidence interval, and then the total indirect effect is just computed by summing these two specific indirect effects right there. Okay, so now we're going to move to a moderated mediation model, and we're going to be treating extroversion as a quantitative moderator variable. So you'll notice that a lot of the syntax that we have is exactly the same as before, but there's a couple of tweaks in this case. Now, you'll notice that right here we're going to be adding in a W variable. So I have W equals, and then this is the extroversion variable that you see up here in this model. And you'll also see that we're adding in a W matrix statement followed by values of 0 and 1. So really briefly though, let's take a look at our model. So in this case right here, we have extroversion being proposed as a moderator of the effect of anxiety on positive coping, and also a moderator of the effect of anxiety on negative coping right here. So these two paths are proposed to be moderated by extroversion. So when it comes to our syntax, what we'll need is not only the B matrix that we have right here, but we're also going to need a W matrix, because we're going to be using the W matrix statement in conjunction with the B matrix statement right here. So basically, as we're looking at our B matrix, we're basically leaving that exactly the same as what we had before. So all of those previous effects, we're going to leave all those values as they were before. Now, with respect to our W matrix right here, though, now we're going to be indicating whether an effect, a direct effect from our B matrix, is being moderated by our extroversion variable. Now, keep in mind, for moderation to take place, there needs to be an effect, a direct effect that's specified in the B matrix. So where you have over here values of 0 in this particular matrix right here, those corresponding values are going to be the same in our W matrix. So this value right here, this value right here, this one, and then this one right here. So then, with respect to the remaining direct effects, then we have to indicate whether moderation is taking place. So with respect to the effect of X on M1, then in that particular case, you'll see over here in our B matrix, we are estimating this effect, but it's not going to be moderated. So because of that, we're actually going to set this value to 0. And then, as we're looking at the effect of M1 on M2 and M1 on M3 right here, we are moderating these effects right here. So because of that, in our W matrix, we'll have these values set to 1 right there. And then with respect to the effect of M2 on Y right here, in terms of the B matrix, so this effect of positive coping on burnout, notice it is not going to be moderated by W. So because of that, this value is going to be set to 0. And then with respect to the direct effect of negative coping on Y right here, there's no moderation that's being specified. So because of that, we're going to be using a value of 0 right here. And so with respect then to the W matrix, we're going to use the same approach that we used with the B matrix, which is we'll start with the first row right here of values. So we have 0 right there, then we move to 0 and 1 right here in the second row, then 0, 1, and 0 in this next row, so 0, 1, and 0, and then in the last row we have 0, 0, 0, 0, so we have the last 4 values being 0. And then finally, keep in mind we have to have a period at the end of our syntax for it to run. So now let's take this syntax and generate our output. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this previous syntax and paste this in. So this is everything that I typed before, and we'll go ahead and highlight it and run it. So now we have our output, and looking at it, you can see it says custom. We have our Y variable, our X variable, anxiety, positive coping, and negative coping, which are our M1, M2, and M3 variables. And then down here we have W for extroversion right there. So briefly looking at the regression models that make up our total moderated mediation model, you can see we have anxiety regressed onto neuroticism as before. Then we have positive coping regressed onto anxiety, extroversion, and then the interaction between anxiety and extroversion. So basically this is going to allow us to test whether the effect of anxiety on positive coping is moderated. So here's the coefficient for the interaction effect, and you can see it's actually statistically significant. We'll scroll down a little bit further, and we have negative coping, which is regressed onto anxiety, extroversion, and then the interaction right here. And you'll notice that the interaction is not statistically significant for that particular model. We'll scroll down a little bit further, and we have burnout, which is regressed onto positive coping and negative coping right there. And then when we scroll down a little bit further, you'll see now we have our indirect effects that are given, and then also the index of moderated mediation. The first indirect effect that's given is actually for the effect of neuroticism on burnout through anxiety and positive coping, and then we have down here the indirect effect of neuroticism on burnout through anxiety and negative coping right there. So you'll see that again we have our indirect effects, basically the conditional indirect effects, as well as the index of moderated mediation with respect to the positive coping mediator and the negative coping mediator right there. Okay, so now let's look at another moderated mediation, basically just kind of adding in a couple of other moderator effects. So in this particular case right here, we are going to treat the effect of X on M1, basically neuroticism on anxiety, as being moderated by extroversion, and we're also going to treat the effect of negative coping on burnout as being moderated by extroversion. So we'll end up changing our W matrix just a bit in this particular case, because now we're going to say that the effect of X on M1, so neuroticism on anxiety, remember there's an effect laid out in the B matrix right here, but now it's going to be moderated, so we're going to use a value of 1 right there. And then with respect to the effect of M3 on Y, basically negative coping on burnout, we are going to now treat that path as being moderated by extroversion. So we're adding in a 1 right here. So those are the two differences between this model and the last model. So with respect to our W matrix, these are the values now that we will include for that. Now you'll notice that in terms of the syntax that's given right here, once again we've got basically process command followed by again the names of our dependent variables, the mediator variables, the X variable, and then also our moderator variable right here. So all that's exactly the same as before. the B matrix is exactly the same as what we had before as well when we ran that last model. So the major difference then is in terms of that W matrix statement. Now you'll notice too that I've got several options specified right here. So I've got this int probe equals 1, moments equals 1, center equals 1, and then plot equals 1, and then I also have contrast equals 1 right here. And I go over those options in a little bit more detail within the PowerPoint. And they are actually specified on this slide right here. So I'm not going to go through all those. I'm going to leave it to you to read up on those particular options. But at any rate, let's go ahead and take this syntax and run the analysis. So we'll go ahead and paste that in to the syntax editor right here. So we have all that information. We'll go ahead and run our model. And looking at our output, again, really all of this information is going to be exactly the same as what we had before. You'll see in this case, anxiety is now regressed onto neuroticism, extroversion, our moderator, and then the interaction that's formed with those two variables. So it's the neuroticism by extroversion interaction effect. Then we'll scroll down. You can see that we have positive coping, again, regressed onto anxiety and extroversion and their interaction. We'll scroll down a little bit further. You can see that negative coping is regressed onto anxiety, extroversion, and their interaction right here. And then when we scroll down a little bit further, you can see that we have burnout, and now it is regressed onto positive coping, negative coping, extroversion, and the interaction between negative coping and extroversion. Okay, so one final twist that I wanted to show you is just a situation where perhaps maybe you want to incorporate a categorical moderator variable. So in this case, I'm taking that order categorical variable extra GP right there. Basically, it has 3 levels, and I'm going to be incorporating this variable into our model. So the syntax is all exactly the same, except now we're going to add in this MCW option. So I'm setting that equal to 1, and that's basically indicating that this extroversion moderator variable, which we have right here, by the way, it says W equals extra GP. The MCW is now going to be indicating that that moderator variable is categorical, and this is going to generate dummy-coded variables for inclusion in the model. So here's a syntax, here's the output after putting that syntax into the syntax editor and running the analysis. So again, all of this information is exactly the same right here, but you'll see that now it says coding of categorical W variable for analysis. So you'll see that basically W1 and W2 are dummy-coded variables, where group 1 is the category that is treated as a reference category for the analyses. So when we scroll down, you can see that we've got our outcome variable anxiety, which is regressed onto neuroticism, the W1, W2 dummy variables, and then we have interactions involving each of those dummy variables that are given. When we scroll down a little bit further, we have positive coping, which is regressed onto anxiety, W1, W2, and then the interactions involving those two dummy variables, and so forth. So as you can see, now we have accounted for our categorical variable just by using that MCW option. Okay, so that pretty well wraps up this video presentation, and I appreciate you watching.